The blazing Arizona sun had just begun its descent when Gabriella Taylor first saw him, a tall figure silhouetted against the dusty horizon, riding into Copper Creek like he owned every inch of the parched earth beneath his horse's hooves. The year was 1878, and Gabriella had exactly $2 to her name, a stolen medical textbook hidden in her trunk, and a reputation that preceded her into every room like an unwelcome shadow. Gabriella wiped perspiration from her brow, adjusting her simple blue dress as she continued hauling water from the well to her modest room above the general store. At 23, she'd already survived more than most women twice her age. The whispers followed her like vultures, the unmarried woman who dared to know medicine, who'd fled Boston after a scandal involving a married doctor, who spoke her mind when ladies were meant to be silent. "You hear about that Taylor woman?" Mrs. Peterson whispered loudly to Mrs. Davis as Gabriella passed. "Thinks she's some kind of doctor. Unnatural, if you ask me." Gabriella pretended not to hear, though her cheeks burned. 6 months in Copper Creek, and still the talk continued. She focused instead on the rider approaching tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a well-worn hat. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty street, and something electric passed between them. Gabriella quickly looked away, reminding herself that mysterious strangers were exactly what had gotten her into trouble before. The stranger dismounted outside the sheriff's office, and Gabriella hurried inside with her water bucket. Her landlord, Mr. Fleming, barely acknowledged her presence, absorbed in his ledger as always. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room, shut the door, and leaned against it, breathing deeply. In the fading light, she opened her medical text and lost herself in its pages, as she did every evening. A sharp knock at her door the next morning startled her awake. She'd fallen asleep at her small table, the medical book still open. Quickly smoothing her hair, she opened the door to find Mrs. Fleming, her landlord's wife, looking unusually agitated. "Miss Taylor, Sheriff Daniels needs your help. There's been an accident at the Holloway mine." 20 minutes later, Gabriella found herself kneeling beside an unconscious miner with a deep gash across his forehead. The small mining office was crowded with concerned men, including the sheriff and the stranger from yesterday, who stood slightly apart from the others. "I need clean water and bandages," Gabriella said, her voice firm despite the murmurs surrounding her. "Should we wait for Doc Simmons to return from Phoenix?" Sheriff Daniels asked uncertainly. "This man may not have that long," she replied, already cleaning the wound with practiced hands. As she worked, she felt the stranger watching her. When she finally looked up, their eyes met again. His were startlingly blue against his sun-bronzed skin. "You've done this before," he stated rather than asked, his deep voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Yes," she answered simply. "Miss Taylor used to assist a doctor back east," Sheriff Daniels explained, his tone suggesting something improper. "Now she just gives remedies to women and children when Doc's away." The stranger nodded, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Hawk Zimmerman," he said, extending his hand after she'd finished bandaging the miner. "Most folks call me Hawk." "Gabriella Taylor," she replied, briefly taking his calloused hand. "Miss Taylor doesn't exactly have medical credentials," the sheriff added pointedly. "Seems to me she has skill, and that's what matters when a man's bleeding," Hawk countered, his gaze never leaving Gabriella's face. The miner regained consciousness, and after ensuring he was stable, Gabriella gathered her things to leave. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. "That was impressive work in there," Hawk said, falling into step beside her. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." "Hawk," he corrected. "I've been hired as the new foreman at the Holloway mine." "Is that why you're in Copper Creek?" "Partly," he replied, something guarded in his expression. "I understand you're somewhat of a healer." "The town has other ideas about what I am," she said carefully. "I don't much care for town opinions," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "My youngest ranch hand took a bad fall 2 days ago. His arm might be broken. Would you be willing to take a look?" Gabriella hesitated. "I'm not a doctor, Mr. Zimmerman. But you know more than anyone else available right now, and Tommy's in pain." She couldn't refuse someone in need. "I'll get my supplies." The Diamond Z Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with a modest main house and several outbuildings. Tommy, a lanky boy of perhaps 19, sat on the porch, his arm cradled awkwardly against his chest. "Miss Taylor's going to help you, Tommy," Hawk explained, helping Gabriella down from her horse. Tommy eyed her suspiciously. "Ain't you the woman they say got run out of Boston for knowing too much medicine?" Hawk interrupted firmly. "Now let her see that arm." Gabriella worked silently, examining the swollen forearm before confirming it was broken. With Hawk's assistance, she set the bone and created a splint, administering willow bark tea for the pain. "You've been properly trained," Hawk observed after Tommy had been settled, with instructions to rest. Gabriella stiffened. "I studied with Dr. Edward Bennett in Boston for 3 years. He believed women could be physicians." "What happened?" She looked away. "His wife discovered our arrangement. She misunderstood our relationship." "Was there something to misunderstand?" "No," she said firmly. "Dr. Bennett was my mentor, nothing more. But in Boston society, a woman with medical ambitions is already suspicious. Add an accusation of impropriety and you ended up in Copper Creek," Hawk finished. "It was as far west as my money would take me," she admitted. "I had hoped for a fresh start." Hawk's expression softened. "Small towns have long memories and active imaginations. So I've discovered." He walked her to her horse, but placed his hand on hers as she reached for the reins. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow, as thanks for helping Tommy?" His touch sent warmth through her fingers. "Mr. Zimmerman." "Hawk," he insisted. "Hawk," she conceded. "I don't think that would be wise." "Your reputation is mine to risk," he interrupted. 6 o'clock? Against her better judgment, Gabriella nodded. By the next afternoon, Copper Creek was buzzing with news that the respectable new mine foreman had invited the scandalous Miss Taylor to dinner. Gabriella heard the whispers as she collected herbs from the meadow outside town. Mrs. Peterson speculating that Gabriella must have worked her wiles on the newcomer, while others suggested Hawk Zimmerman might have unsavory intentions himself. She nearly decided not to go, but something about Hawk's directness, his lack of pretense, drew her. At precisely 6, she arrived at the Diamond Z, wearing her one good dress, a forest green that complemented her auburn hair. Hawk himself answered the door, dressed in clean but simple clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. "You came," he said, genuine pleasure lighting his features. "I considered changing my mind several times," she admitted. "I'm glad you didn't," he replied, ushering her inside. The main house was modest but comfortable, with solid furniture and few decorative touches. Hawk had prepared a simple meal, venison stew, fresh bread, and early spring vegetables. "You cook?" she asked, surprised. "I've lived alone most of my adult life," he explained, pulling out her chair. "A man either learns to cook or resigns himself to a life of beans and hardtack." Over dinner, Gabriella learned that Hawk had fought for the Union during the war, then spent years working ranches across the West before settling into mining operations. He spoke little of family, mentioning only a younger sister living in St. Louis. "And what about you?" he asked. "How does a Boston society woman end up practicing frontier medicine?" "I was hardly society," she laughed. "My father was a bookkeeper who believed in education. My mother died when I was 16 pneumonia. The doctor couldn't save her, but I was fascinated by everything he tried." "So you decided to become a doctor." "I decided to learn," she corrected. "Women aren't exactly welcome in medical colleges." "That's changing, isn't it? I read about a women's medical college in Pennsylvania." Gabriella looked at him with surprise. "You follow such things?" "I read everything I can get my hands on," he said. "The mind needs exercise as much as the body." As the evening progressed, Gabriella found herself relaxing. Hawk asked intelligent questions about her medical knowledge and shared stories of his travels without the exaggerated bravado common among Western men. "I should be getting back to town," she said reluctantly as they finished coffee on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "I'll ride with you," Hawk insisted. "It's not safe after dark." They rode in companionable silence, the cooling desert air carrying the scent of sage. At the edge of town, however, Gabriella grew tense again, aware of curtains twitching as they passed. "They're watching," she murmured. "Let them," Hawk replied simply. Outside the general store, he helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for asking," she replied, suddenly aware of how close he stood. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, but he merely tipped his hat and mounted his horse. "Good night, Gabriella." She watched him ride away, a curious mixture of relief and disappointment swirling within her. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed frequently. Hawk brought injured miners to Gabriella when Doc Simmons was unavailable, and she found herself invited to the Diamond Z for dinner at least once a week. Each time they talked late into the evening, discovering shared interests in literature and natural science. The town's whispers intensified. Gabriella overheard Mrs. Peterson tell the dressmaker that Hawk Zimmerman must be simple-minded to involve himself with a woman of questionable virtue. When the blacksmith's daughter fell ill with fever, several mothers suggested that perhaps Miss Taylor shouldn't be called, despite her known success with childhood ailments, lest she somehow corrupt their daughters. Hawk seemed oblivious to the talk, or perhaps simply unconcerned. He began accompanying Gabriella to church on Sundays, sitting beside her despite the disapproving glances from the congregation. Afterward, they often rode into the hills, where Gabriella collected healing plants and Hawk pointed out animal tracks and geological formations. "Why do you bother with me?" she asked one Sunday, as they rested beneath a gnarled oak tree. "It's only making things more difficult for you in town." "Because you're worth knowing," he answered simply. "And because I recognize what it means to be judged for circumstances rather than character." Something in his tone made her study him more carefully. "You speak from experience." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "My father was a horse thief," he finally said. "Hanged when I was 12. My mother worked as a laundress, but we were never welcome anywhere after that." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It taught me to judge people by their own actions, not rumors." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Just as I judge you by your dedication to healing, not by whatever Boston gossips claimed." Their eyes held, and this time when he leaned toward her, Gabriella didn't pull away. His kiss was gentle, questioning, and she answered by sliding her hand to his shoulder, drawing him closer. When they broke apart, Hawk tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," she confessed, feeling her cheeks flush. They returned to town hand in hand, and though Gabriella could feel the stares following them, for once she didn't care. That evening, as Gabriella sat reading in her room above the general store, urgent knocking rattled her door. She opened it to find Sally Jenkins, the blacksmith's wife, her face streaked with tears. "It's Betsy," she gasped. "The fever's worse, and she can't breathe right. Doc Simmons is drunk again, and my Robert said to fetch you, pride be damned." Gabriella grabbed her medical bag and hurried out. Betsy Jenkins, only 7 years old, lay burning with fever, her breathing labored and a rash spreading across her chest measles, complicated by pneumonia. For hours, Gabriella worked tirelessly, applying cool compresses, administering herbal remedies, and showing Sally how to create steam for Betsy to breathe. By dawn, the child's fever had broken, and her breathing had eased considerably. "She needs rest and fluids," Gabriella instructed the exhausted parents. "I'll return this evening to check on her." As she stepped outside, blinking in the early morning light, she was surprised to find Hawk waiting, holding the reins of her horse. "Sally's boy came to get me when she fetched you," he explained. "Thought you might need help." Overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness, Gabriella nearly swayed on her feet. Hawk was beside her instantly, his arm strong around her waist. "When did you last sleep?" he asked, concern etching his features. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Yesterday morning, perhaps." Without another word, he lifted her onto her horse and mounted behind her, keeping one arm firmly around her waist as they rode back to town. He ignored the stares of early risers as he helped her down and escorted her to her room. "Rest," he insisted, his hand gently cupping her face. "I'll check on you later." She slept deeply, waking in the late afternoon to find a basket outside her door containing fresh bread, preserves, and a note in Hawk's strong handwriting. "Betsy is improving. Rest longer if needed." That evening, as Gabriella checked on Betsy, Sally Jenkins grasped her hand. "I was wrong about you." the woman said quietly. "We all were. You saved my daughter when no one else could." Word of Betsy's recovery spread quickly, and gradually Gabriella found the hostile stares softening. "Mrs. Peterson actually nodded to her at the mercantile, and the preacher's wife asked her advice about a persistent cough. Hawk continued his courtship openly, escorting Gabriella to the town's Independence Day celebration, where, to her surprise, several women invited her to contribute to the communal dinner. As fireworks illuminated the desert sky, Hawk led her away from the crowd, down to a quiet spot by the creek. "I have something to ask you," he said, his usually confident voice uncertain. "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more sure of anything." He took her hands in his blue eyes reflecting the distant firelight. "Gabriella Taylor, I love your brilliant mind, your compassionate heart, and your unwavering courage. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to her eyes. "Hawk, are you certain?" "There will always be those who—" "Let them talk," he interrupted, squeezing her hands. "All that matters is what's between us." "Yes," she whispered, joy bursting within her like the fireworks overhead. "Yes, I will marry you." Their kiss sealed the promise, deep and tender beneath the star-filled sky. News of their engagement rippled through Copper Creek like wildfire. Most offered congratulations, though some still whispered behind their hands. The wedding was set for October, when the desert heat would have subsided. One evening in late August, as Gabriella was closing the small clinic she'd established in a vacant storefront, with Doc Simmons' grudging blessing, Sheriff Daniels burst in, his face grave. "There's been a cave-in at the Holloway mine," he said breathlessly. "Multiple injured. Hawk sent for you specifically." Heart pounding, Gabriella gathered her supplies and rode with the sheriff to the mine. The scene was chaos dust, covered miners being pulled from the shaft, others digging frantically. "Where's Hawk?" she demanded, scanning the faces. "Still inside," a miner replied grimly. "He went back for Jimenez when the second collapse happened." The next hours passed in a blur as Gabriella treated broken bones, lacerations, and dust-choked lungs. All the while, her eyes kept returning to the mine entrance, praying for Hawk's familiar figure to emerge. When rescuers finally brought him out unconscious, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, Gabriella's professional demeanor nearly shattered. She forced herself to focus, cleaning his wounds and setting his broken leg while fighting back tears. "His head took a bad hit," she explained to the concerned miners gathered around. "We need to get him back to town." For 3 days, Hawk remained unconscious in a room at the boarding house, Gabriella rarely leaving his side. On the 4th morning, as she was bathing his forehead, his eyelids flickered. "Gabby," he whispered hoarsely. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I'm here," she managed, grasping his hand. "Jimenez?" "He's recovering," she assured him. "Everyone made it out alive, thanks to you." Hawk's recovery was slow but steady. The town that had once whispered about Gabriella now praised her dedication. Even Mrs. Peterson brought soup and sat with Hawk when Gabriella needed rest. By early October, Hawk could walk with a cane, insisting the wedding proceed as planned. "I'm not letting a broken leg delay making you my wife," he declared. They married on a perfect autumn day, the cottonwoods along the creek blazing gold against the azure sky. The entire town turned out, the church overflowing with well-wishers. When Gabriella walked down the aisle in a cream-colored dress with sage blossoms in her hair, Hawk's face shone with such love that she forgot everything but him. The reception lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the town square. As twilight painted the desert in purple shadows, Gabriella noticed Mrs. Peterson approaching with an unusual expression of humility. "Miss Taylor, Mrs. Zimmerman now," she corrected herself. "I owe you an apology. We all judged you unfairly without knowing you." "That's behind us now," Gabriella replied kindly. "Well, we've taken up a collection," Mrs. Peterson continued, gesturing to several townswomen who stood nearby, "for proper medical supplies. The town needs a good healer, especially with Doc Simmons retiring." Tears pricked Gabriella's eyes as the women presented her with an envelope containing enough money to properly equip her clinic. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of the Diamond Z, now their home, Hawk wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" he murmured. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "When I came to Copper Creek, I thought my dream of practicing medicine was over. Now I have that and so much more." "You earned it," he said, turning her in his arms. "Your courage in facing down this town's prejudice showed everyone what you're made of." "I couldn't have done it without you standing beside me," she admitted. "And I'll keep standing there," he promised, "through whatever comes next." What came next was a gradual transformation of Copper Creek. By the spring of 1879, Gabriella's clinic was officially recognized when Doc Simmons retired, naming her his successor. She began corresponding with the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania, eventually arranging for a formal assessment that granted her legitimate credentials. The Diamond Z prospered under Hawk's management as he expanded from mining into cattle raising. When a fire destroyed half the town's business district in 1880, the Zimmermans led the rebuilding efforts, with Hawk designing a new water system and Gabriella establishing the town's first proper hospital. In the summer of 1881, their family expanded with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth. Standing beside Gabriella's bed, holding their newborn while his wife rested, Hawk marveled at how completely his life had changed. "What are you thinking?" Gabriella asked sleepily, reaching for his hand. "That I rode into Copper Creek looking for a fresh start, never imagining I'd find my entire world," he replied, gently placing their daughter in her arms. "Remember our first dinner together?" she asked. "When you told me about judging people by their actions, not rumors?" He nodded, sitting beside her on the bed. "That was the moment I began to fall in love with you," she admitted. "Before then, I'd resigned myself to being alone. And now? Now I know that sometimes whispers lead to wonderful things," she smiled, "especially when someone brave enough says, 'Let them talk.'" As their family grew with a son, James, joining them in 1883, so did their standing in the community. By the time the railroad reached Copper Creek in 1885, transforming the once isolated mining town into a regional hub, the Zimmermans were among its most respected citizens. Gabriella's medical practice flourished, drawing patients from across the territory. She eventually trained several young women as nurses, creating opportunities that had once been denied to her. Hawk's business ventures expanded to include a stake in the railroad and the town's first bank, though he never lost his connection to the land, still preferring horseback to carriages and business suits. On their 10th anniversary, as they stood watching their children play in the yard of their expanded ranch house, Hawk pulled Gabriella close. "Do you ever think about Boston?" he asked. "About how differently your life might have gone?" She considered the question, watching Elizabeth teach her little brother how to identify healing plants, knowledge Gabriella had passed down. In the distance, the town of Copper Creek sprawled larger than before, with her hospital visible on the hillside. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only with gratitude that it led me here. To a dusty mining town that once whispered behind your back," he teased. "To you," she corrected, turning in his arms. "To the man who took my hand and said, 'Let them talk,' to the life we've built together." As the Arizona sunset painted the desert in gold and crimson, much as it had the evening of their first dinner together, Hawk kissed his wife with the same tenderness as on that first day by the creek. Their journey from scandal to respect, from whispers to admiration, had been hard won, but neither would have changed a single step of the path that had brought them home.